Hello everyone, welcome to lecture 4 of the course Philosophy of Science for Psychologists.
Wittgenstein 1, that's the younger Wittgenstein. We'll see in a later lecture that he changed his mind, and then he is known in philosophy as Wittgenstein 2, later Wittgenstein, had a big influence on the logical positivists. And the lecture of today basically is about the logical positivists and their ideas about science. So today we change from epistemology to actual philosophy of science with the logical positivists who were influenced by Ludwig Wittgenstein, the younger Ludwig Wittgenstein, and he was concerned with problems, and I want to start with a philosophical problem about truth so we can see what Wittgenstein was interested in. Of course, we look at the view of the logical positivism, but we look at it critically, so we evaluate the views of the logical positivists after we've introduced them, and then we'll see where that leaves us and also where what happened in history and what we have to look at in next lecture. And of course we'll end with a test question. Today's lecture is about logical positivism. Those guys were empiricists, were philosophers of science, and they were influenced by Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein was concerned with a problem of truth. So let's start with a problem of truth. The problem about truth is nicely illustrated by this quote by the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. So let me read it aloud, and then I hope you will immediately see what the problem with truth here is. So he's talking about truth, and he then says in one of his books, the so understood freedom of the being living, of the beings, fulfills and performs the essence of truth. So it's about truth in the essence of truth, in the sense of the unsalvaging of being. That's pretty clear. The truth, and mind the quotation marks here, is not a hallmark of the correct sentence uttered by a human subject of an object, which then somehow is true, and of course true in a kind of range. But the truth is the unsalvaging of beings that exists only due to an openness. So I think it's pretty obvious what the problem of truth here is. I think most people will respond to quotes like this with the reaction, what the hell does this mean? This seems totally and utterly meaningless, and not only because Heidegger puts words between brackets, between quotation marks. Because if you put subject between quotation marks, then apparently you're not talking about the subject. So, okay, I don't know what you're talking about. If someone does this, then you say, well, you're talking about something else than the thing you apparently seem to be talking about. So, Wittgenstein was interested in, maybe not in truth, but of course we'll see in a moment that it also implies that he was interested in truth. He was interested in meaningful sentences. What makes a sentence a meaningful sentence and what makes a sentence a meaningless sentence? So if I say that in my cup there's coffee, I think you know what I mean. I might be lying, there might be whiskey in it, but you know what I mean. You understand my sentence. But if I say there, the being is there because of the existence of an openness or whatever it was, to me, it's also meaningless. I can't even recall what I just read. So then you'll say, well, that seems to be a meaningless sentence. And that is what Wittgenstein was interested in. So we'll take it from there. I'll show you in a moment why Wittgenstein was interested in this distinction between meaningful and meaningless sentences, and then how this is of interest to the logical positivists who were interested in science. Wittgenstein was thinking about what makes a sentence a meaningful sentence. We'll see that that's related to truth, and that the logical positivists were influenced by Wittgenstein. Today we're talking about the young Wittgenstein. He's called in philosophy Wittgenstein 1. Later we'll look at the older Wittgenstein, who then is called Wittgenstein 2. It's the same person, but he changed his mind with respect to his philosophy of language, you could say, his philosophy about meaning of sentences. Wittgenstein 1 wrote the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. He published that in 1921. And we'll see in the next lecture, because we also see that Wittgenstein 2 has had an influence on other philosophers that are relevant to this course, so we'll take a look at that in a later lecture. But he also wrote a book that is, there is a book published after he died in 1953, that's called The Philosophical Investigations. That book wasn't finished, and we'll see that that also is a problem then, that it wasn't finished, because we don't have all the answers to the questions what he actually meant with some of his sentences, his theories. So we'll return to Wittgenstein 2 later. Today we'll talk about Wittgenstein 1, and he was born in 1889, and he came from Vienna. So that is important that he lived in Vienna, or it's at least important to see how easy it was for the logical positivists to be influenced by Wittgenstein, because they started as a movement also in Vienna. Okay, so Wittgenstein 1 was interested in the higher. He says, I'm a philosopher and I'm interested in sentences that express something higher. And the higher here means not something about height, but it means about something about deep and important sentences. Sentences about art, about metaphysics. So about why there is a world, for instance, which things are there are in the world, and not seen from a scientific point of view. He was interested in aesthetics. He was interested in ethics. He was interested in spiritualism, in poetry. So deep sentences, or the higher, mystical sentences. He was interested in mystical things. So, but he didn't want to say anything meaningless about that. So he was interested in the more high, the more profound theories about humans and our actions and the world, but he didn't want to make claims about that were meaningless, that were nonsensical. So he wrote a book, the Tractatus, a really difficult book, in which he tried to separate sense from nonsense, meaningful sentences from meaningless sentences. And in the end, he defends what's called a correspondence theory of truth and a correspondence theory of meaning. So you'll see that there is indeed a relation between meaning and truth, but of course we're not talking about a silly thing we started with, this problem of truth. We're talking about what truth is, and then you'll see that he defends a correspondence theory. Is it difficult? Intuitively, you all use the correspondence theory of truth when you say to someone, you're a liar. If you say Trump is a liar, you mean he claims something that does not correspond with the facts. We'll discuss that in one of the knowledge clips of the alternative to the tutorials, again, in a slightly different way. So let me just now explain it, and if you think this is difficult, then there is an alternative tutorial knowledge clip. So the correspondence theory of truth basically says you have a sentence which expresses a belief. We've seen that before when we say knowledge is justified and true belief. We usually express knowledge in sentences. And now we say, okay, I have a belief about the world. I have a belief that there's a cup of coffee on the table. I'm telling you that in a sentence. So I say there's a cup of coffee on the table. That's what I say. And this corresponds to the facts. It is factually true. It is actually the case. It's real. Reality is such, the world is such that there indeed this is a cup of coffee and now it's back on the table. So the sentence or the belief, the cup of coffee is on the table, is true. Why is that sentence true? Because there actually is a cup of coffee on the table. It describes the fact the way the facts are. The sentence describes the facts the way the facts are. The belief represents the world the way the world is. It corresponds, the belief and the sentence correspond to the facts. So hence, the correspondence theory of truth. Wittgenstein adds a correspondence theory of meaning. So when is a sentence like, there's a cup of coffee on the table, true? Well, when it expresses the way the world is, when it corresponds to the facts. When is a sentence meaningful? Well, when you can check whether it corresponds to the facts or not. Well, what do I have to do? I can look, I see a cup, there's a dark substance in it, I can't really show it to you, but I can taste it for myself. Definitely coffee. So now I have established that indeed there's coffee in the cup. I am capable of establishing what the facts are in clearly an empiricist way. That's what I did now. I just used my senses to see whether the sentence was true or not. I could also say there is whiskey in the cup, and then I'll do the same if I want to check whether that's true or not. I look at it and see, well, there's a dark substance in it. I don't think that that's whiskey, but let's taste it. And then I say, no, it's coffee. So then I have falsified the claim. I say, no, it's not true. It's false. But I can still establish whether it's true or not. And that still makes it a meaningful sentence. So now I have a meaningful sentence. There is whiskey in the cup, but it's false. But it's still meaningful. Now, Wittgenstein says, if you cannot establish whether a sentence corresponds to the facts, then it's meaningless. So a sentence is meaningful if you can establish whether or not it corresponds to the facts. And then we have now two sentences. There's coffee in the cup and there's whiskey in the cup. In both cases, I know how to check whether the sentences correspond to the facts. Use my senses. And if I use my senses, then I see one sentence is true, the other is false. Both are meaningful because I am able to check whether they correspond to the facts. But what about God is good? Or something like the primary basis of the world is the unconsciousness. I have no idea of how I should check that. What do I have to do to check whether these sentences express parts of the world, represent parts of the world, describe parts of the world, the way the world is. I have no idea. I'm not able to see whether the sentences correspond to the fact, and then Wittgenstein says, well, then the sentence is meaningless. So if I say the primary basis of the world is the unconsciousness, then I might as well say blah, 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 blah. That's just as meaningful. It doesn't mean anything. Now, which sentences then are meaningful? Well, those are the sentences that express these everyday things, like there's a cup of coffee on the table, and then you might want to know what coffee actually is, and you might want to know what the chemical analysis is, and you go and do science. So everyday sentences and scientific sentences are, well, on a spectrum, you might say, and that's basically what Wittgenstein says. The sentences you can check with your senses, those, or using the scientific method, those are the meaningful sentences. And everything else is meaningless. And that means that the sentences he was interested in are all meaningless. Everything from metaphysics, so the kind of philosophy we started with this Heidegger quote, ethics, aesthetics, the mystical, the spiritual, the theological, all these domains are all what is being said or has been said about that. It's all meaningless according to Wittgenstein. And that was what he was interested in. So he says, well, the things I'm interested in are all meaningless. I'm not interested in science. He wasn't. So he says, if you cannot figure out by looking at the world whether a sentence is true or false, then the sentence is meaningless. And that means that if you say something like the beautiful is identical to the good, if you are doing aesthetics or ethics, then that's a meaningful sentence. How do you establish, by looking at the world, whether the beautiful actually is identical to the good? I don't know. The soul is immortal. How are you going to check that? And if you can't check it, it's meaningless. But he wanted to say something about the soul. But then again, he couldn't, because he says, I can't see whether that checked. I can't check whether it corresponds to the facts or not. And that means, and here we'll see something strange, because I think that most of you have pretty good idea what people would mean when they say the soul is immortal. So there is kind of a problem here with this theory. And that problem also relates to the statements in which Wittgenstein describes this entire theory in his Tractatus. Because in his Tractatus he uses all these sentences, and it's really difficult. You can have a look at it, but don't try to read it on your own or in an evening. It takes months to understand it, even though it's a really small book. So you can probably understand the first sentences and the last, and in between it's all logic and really difficult. But these sentences do not seem to correspond to facts, or at least they are sentences that I do not know how to establish whether they correspond to the fact or not. And then the ideas of the Tractatus itself, that those sentences are meaningless. How does he solve that? Well, he says, well, my propositions, my sentences, are enlightening because he who finally understands me, you can understand him, so apparently the sentences do have meaning, recognizes them as nonsensical, as meaningless. And through my statements, he has climbed above them on it. Okay, so he compares this to a ladder, and once you have used the ladder to get on top of, well, the roof or something where you want to be, or something higher, if you're there, then you can throw away the letter. Yeah, but how do I get there? So he seems to be cheating in some sense. He is trying to explain what a meaningful sentence is by using meaningless sentences. And then you say, well, if you understand my meaningless sentences, then you know I'm right. Then you'll understand that the correspondence theory of truth is right and the correspondence theory of meaning is right. Okay, we have to return to this later. Of course, you'll understand, you'll get that this is the point where Wittgenstein later changed his mind, and then we are talking about Wittgenstein 2. But back to Wittgenstein 1, he wrote this book. What can we speak of? Well, about everyday statements, about the statements of that we find in the empirical sciences, but we cannot speak of anything higher. We cannot say anything about the important questions of life, basically, or at least what Wittgenstein thought were the important issues in life. And then he ends the Tractatus with his famous quote, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. So if you can't say anything about something, well, why say something about it? Just be silent. And that means that Wittgenstein says, well, if you have a problem, it's either a scientific problem, science being something that is much about things in everyday life also, so everyday life sentences and scientific sentences are very closely related. So a problem is either a scientific problem or it's nonsensical. So if this Heidegger, who was a metaphysician, he was thinking about questions like, why is there nothing rather, why is there something rather than nothing? That's metaphysics. You can't say anything meaningful about it. It's all senseless what you say about it. So why bother? Why write these big books in which you claim that the nothing is, well, is doing nothing or something like that? I don't know. I really have trouble. I'm a bit in line with Wittgenstein, because I do think many of these things at least sound meaningless, and I have a hard time recalling them, what he actually said. So what did Wittgenstein do? He quits philosophy. He says, I want to do philosophy about all these meaningful things, or these important things in life. I want to do philosophy about the higher, what he calls the higher, and I can't do that. Well, and I quit. So, and Wittgenstein was very, well, he took the consequences of his own analysis, and he stops. He becomes a teacher. But later we'll see that he returns to philosophy. Now let's look at the logical positivists. These were empiricists and philosophers of science. Here we clearly see that we go from epistemology to philosophy of science. The logical positivists started off as the Schlick-Kreis, the circle around Moritz Schlick. They also were known as the Wiener Kreis because they started off in Vienna, so the Vienna Circle, and they were also known as the logical empiricists because they were empiricists. So they came together, the first group came together in the 1920s in Vienna, and what they wanted to get rid of the type of philosophy we started this lecture with, this type of philosophy of Martin Heidegger, which to them was also meaningless, nonsensical. So you get rid of that. Why are there so many people doing this type of philosophy? We should get rid of that. What is interesting, I think, is that these were not just philosophers, there were a lot of scientists, there were physicists, sociologists, philosophers of science, people doing logic, mathematics. So it was a really diverse group of philosophers and scientists who tried to get rid of nonsensical, unscientific claims in philosophy and in science, of course. And then they read this Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus of someone also living in their city, in Vienna, Wittgenstein, and we'll see that that indeed influenced them in their thinking about science, because what we have seen in Wittgenstein is Wittgenstein says, I'm interested in meaningful sentences. Which sentences are meaningful? Well, everyday sentences and the scientific sentences, and they're closely related. You might even say that they are the same set, and that is basically what the logical positivists then find in Wittgenstein. They want to get rid of meaningless sentences, and they find a criterion in Wittgenstein, the young Wittgenstein's book. So you can see how they said, well, that is an important book, and they build on that in their theory. In 1929, they write a pamphlet called The Scientific Conception of the World, the Vienna Circle, and as we'll see in a moment, that this pamphlet really marks the start of philosophy of science as a distinct subdiscipline of philosophy. So we've been doing epistemology, you've been thinking about knowledge, and of course we already talked about science, but we're not really doing philosophy of science. We're not involved in this project of trying to understand what science actually is. We just were mentioning science, we were referring to science, but not thinking about science, what makes a discipline scientific and what makes it makes another discipline not scientific, or another type of human behavior not scientific. The logical positivist really started to think about this question, what is science? We'll see in a moment how this changed. But you can see this change in this 1929 pamphlet. In this pamphlet, they basically give us their program, their ideas on science and what the goal is of science and their philosophy. And well, they have 5 key points. Let me mention them here and then we'll discuss them. So the rejection of meaningless statements, that's much on a par with Wittgenstein 1's project, of course. They are logical positivists, so what's this about logic? What's positivism? We have to look at that. They were defending a unified science, that is important. So they do not say that social sciences and natural sciences are 2 distinct types of science. No, they are unified, they are going together. And I just mentioned that there are physicists and sociologists in this group of the Wiener Kreis. And then maybe the most important thing is, well, the need of a demarcation criterion. And the demarcation criterion is a criterion that separates 2 things from each other. And in this case, science from not science, from non-science, from pseudoscience even. So what we'll do today is we'll look at these 5 key points, I'll explain them to you, and then we'll evaluate them, see where that leaves us, where it left philosophers and scientists in thinking about science in this historical period. Okay, so they wanted to reject meaningless statements. So what they wanted to do was to remove the metaphysical and theological debris of millennia. So that's from their 1929 pamphlet. So they wanted to get rid of metaphysics, philosophy like that of Heidegger, and they wanted to get rid of theological nonsense, debris. They wanted to get rid of that. So they wanted to have statements that were meaningful, And their claim is, well, metaphysics and theology is all meaningless. So they follow Wittgenstein 1. Meaningful statements are scientific statements and vice versa, and of course also the statements about everyday reality, but science is of course about everyday reality, so these go together. And now they say, and I think this is an important lesson to be learned here from the logical positivist, Hahn, Neurath, Carnap, the three authors of the 1929 pamphlet. So they wrote it, and the other logical positivists, they signed it. They say, well, we agree with what those three guys have said. They say, if someone asserts there is a God, or the primary basis of the world is the unconsciousness, we do not say to him, what you say is false, but we ask him, what do you mean by these statements? These statements reveal themselves as empty of meaning, they're meaningless, they claim, if one takes them in the way that the metaphysicians intend. So if you say, well, if you take them the way they are meant to be taken, then all these sentences are meaningless. They're just blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah is not a sentence that's meaningful. The primary basis of the world is the unconsciousness is just as meaningful. Hence, it's meaningless. But you don't say it's not true. You don't say it's false. You say, what do you mean? There is a God. Well, just explain to me what you mean by God. And then, if you have this correspondence theory of meaning, then you say, okay, so how is this a meaningful sentence? Can you point out God to me? Can you show me that you're right? No, or wrong? No, it's meaningless. Okay, so I think that is an important question anyway. So also, if you don't understand someone's claims, your first reaction should not be, that's wrong. Your question should be, well, please explain to me what you mean. And I think that is also good if in the end it turns out that someone is actually making a meaningful claim. Make sure you know what you're debating. So make sure what your terms refer to. So I think this is a good lesson anyway. Alfred Eyre, here a quote of Alfred Eyre, a British logical positivist. He says, well, indeed, he's writing about the logical positivist here, and he says, well, what is our goal? The goal is to set philosophy upon the sure path of science. So we want really to get rid of these nonsensical claims of Heidegger about the nothing doing nothing and the truth being there because there is an openness of, well, whatever he said. It's meaningless, and we want to get rid of that type of philosophy. The type of philosophy that tells you that a cow eats grass because of her cowness. What the hell? We want to get rid of that. Nobody should be bothered with nonsense like that. That's what the logical positivist would claim. And that means that a lot of philosophy, and also still a lot of philosophy that we're doing today, would become meaningless, and you should abandon that. You should do what Wittgenstein did. If you're interested in metaphysics, well, do something else because it's meaningless. If you're interested in theology, that's maybe not for philosophers but for theologians, stop doing it because you're wasting your life. According to Wittgenstein 1, according to the logical positivist. And of course, if someone says God is good or the soul is immortal, we already have seen in the explanation of Wittgenstein 1, there is something dubious here to make the claim that that doesn't mean anything. Because at least if you're in a church, all these people seem to mean something by God is good and God exists. And the soul is immortal. So it might not be true, that's a different question, but is it meaningless? Okay, so we can understand that if you have a different criterion of what a meaningful sentence is, then a sentence like God is good or the primary basis of the world is the unconsciousness becomes meaningful again. And then you can see, okay, why we're still doing metaphysics where there's still theology. Even though maybe, I'm not saying Wittgenstein 1 or Wittgenstein 2, who has a different criterion of meaning, is right. It's just, if you go along with Wittgenstein 1 and the logical positivist, these kinds of sentences do not make sense anymore. They are just blah, blah, blah. You should not waste your time saying blah, blah, blah all day. So that's the implication for philosophy. Most of philosophy becomes meaningless. The implication for psychology is different. You should not use terms like soul, psyche, anger, thought, because they all be regarded as part of metaphysics. They refer to some subjective inner mental state you can't observe. So what should you do? I hope this sounds familiar to you. You should, as a psychologist, do science about the things you are able to observe. You can observe behavior, human behavior. Input goes in, whatever hell happens there, I don't know. I'm silent about that, of which one cannot speak, thereof one should be silent. And there is output, and I can observe that and say something about it. So, and that is what the logical positivists wrote in their 1929 pamphlet. They said, psychology as the behaviorist does it, that's the way to go. So they were also rejecting introspectionism, and they were defending behaviorism. They say, well, that's the way you should do psychology. And of course, we've seen that in the philosophy of mind course. But this is one of the reasons why you could defend behaviorism as the way to do psychology. Okay, so let's go to the second key point, logic. Let me be brief here because this is really tricky and problematic and not that relevant in the end for our quest to make to be able to make a difference between science and pseudoscience and to see whether psychology then is a science. So if you look at the logical positivist, you can say, well, you can immediately, directly describe the world using sentences. They're called protocol sentences. So a sentence like, this is a cup of coffee, refers immediately to something I can observe. And they are all connected, those sentences. So if you have a theory, basically, a theory should be logical. They should be logically connected, all the sentences about the world. And then logic becomes a kind of a tool, you could say. So logic, if you say, if A then B, and A, well, the logical conclusion is, well, thus B. But that doesn't say anything about reality. It doesn't refer to things you can see, right? So it's a structure, you could say. It's the underlying structure of sentences, of thought, of scientific sentences combining together into a theory. So logic is playing an important role in the logical positivist philosophy of science because it's a tool to structure your theory, to find out that there might be a contradiction in your theory. If you have a theory that if you look at the logical structure says A and also says not A, then you say A and not A, that's a contradiction. This is a cup of coffee and it's not a cup of coffee. Well, that can be true. Those sentences can both be true. But still, you don't have said anything about what actually is true. The only thing you know is the sentences, this is a cup of coffee and this is not a cup of coffee, can't both be true, but it doesn't say which one of the two is true. So logic is an instrument and not a method to gain knowledge about the world. If you have found a contradiction in your theory, you haven't found out which of the two sentences that contradict each other is true. So it doesn't tell you anything about the world. So logic and also mathematics is not a way to gain knowledge. So if you compare this to what we have seen in previous lecture, this distinction between synthetic and analytic, this distinction between analyzing, describing what you already know, and finding out new things, synthetic judgments. We are interested in those synthetic judgments because we are trying to understand where we get new knowledge from. And then Kant says, well, logic and mathematics, that's a method of gaining knowledge, of coming up with synthetic judgments a priori, using your ratio only, your reason only. The logical positivists, they are empiricists, they reject that. And then they put logic in analytic a priori. It's a tool to analyze things. Okay, so as I said last lecture, make sure you also understand how empiricists, like the logical positivists, think about these two concepts, these two pairs of concepts, a priori and a posteriori, and synthetic and analytic judgments. Right. Let's go to key point 3, positivism. We have seen, of course, already a view on positivism. We have seen Auguste Comte, who introduced this notion of positivism, a theory about what positivism is. And then, of course, you can have different views on what you mean by the word positivism. It can refer to the view of Auguste Comte in his entire theory. But I hope you'll see that the logical positivist would not accept everything. In the end, Auguste Comte founded a church, and the logical positivist wanted to get rid of theology. Okay, so they can't accept everything Auguste Comte said. What is interesting is, to the logical positivist, is that if you have a problem, you have a scientific problem. It's always a scientific problem. If you have a problem, the best method to solve it is the scientific method. And that's what they take from Auguste Comte, and that's what positivism then is, the view that science is the only source of real knowledge. So that is just a part of Auguste Comte's theory. And now I hope you see that we have this change from epistemology to philosophy of science. Because the logical positivists say, okay, there is this idea that science is the only real source of knowledge, and they're very clear about that. And then they do what they always do. Then they say, I'm not saying that this is wrong or correct or whatever. I am saying, what do you mean by this claim? And now they ask him, not metaphysicians or theologians, that question. They ask that question themselves. What do we mean by saying this is a science? What do we mean by the word science? And then you start thinking about science. Then you start thinking critically about science. What is science? And if you give an answer to that, is that the correct answer? So then you're doing philosophy of science. So you have this epistemological question, where does knowledge come from? And this question now is being answered by knowledge comes from science. Okay, now we have an answer to that question, but it raises another question. It raises the question, what then is science? So here we really see this change from epistemology to philosophy of science. But of course, we're doing philosophy of science because we're interested in this question, where does synthetic judgments, where do synthetic judgments come from? Where does knowledge come from? It comes from science. Okay, so we're going to do philosophy of science. Before that, so that's key point 5, this trying to find an answer to the question, what is science? Let's first take a look at one other key feature of the logical positivist's view on knowledge and science. They say, well, scientists are all working together on a theory about the world. So basically what you want is a theory that describes the world the way the world is, and it doesn't mind if you're a biologist, a psychologist, a physicist or a sociologist, you're all trying to find out what the facts are of the world, of the social world, the biological world, the psychological world, the physical world, and of course that's all just one world. There's different aspects of the same world. So the world is everything there is, all the facts together, and you're trying to find out what the facts are, and then you can make predictions about the world, just like the behaviorist said. So just like Watson said, what's the goal of behaviorism? What is the goal of psychology? Well, is the prediction and control of behavior. You want to predict what people are going to do. You want to predict what animals are going to do. And if you can predict what human beings will do in certain circumstances, because you have all these dispositions, that in a certain circumstance you will do that, if that's kind of a rule you have discovered about the world, about the facts, then you can use that in a therapy, for instance, because then you can predict and control behavior. And that's what you want to do. You want to help people display odd behavior. We might say, well, they have mental problems, but of course, mental problems in behaviorist terms translates to they're behaving in an odd way, or an inconvenient way, inconvenient to themselves, or, well, inconvenient already is maybe too much of a mental way of describing it. So you're trying to find out, that's basically what you're saying, you're trying to find out what the facts are about the world, and all scientists work together. And then the question is, what unifies science? And then the answer is, it's a deductive nomological model. So it's deduction. We've seen that before, deduction. Not induction, but deduction. And this is called the deductive nomological model. Nomos is the old Greek word for law, so it's the covering law model. It's a law. You start with a law. So premise one, if in a type of reasoning, so you have a premise one, a premise two, and then a conclusion. Premise one is a general statement. It states a law, or is law-like. It's a rule, and you can call that a nomological statement. Then you have a starting statement, and then you have a conclusion or prediction. So let me give an example. It's deduction, it's not induction. Induction is generalization. Then you go from individuals to a law, and here you start with a law. Here you start with premise one, all swans are white. And then you say, this here is a swan. And then the conclusion, the prediction is, this swan is white. That has to be the case. If premise one is true, and if premise 2 is also true, then this conclusion necessarily follows. So this is a logically valid way of reasoning. That is interesting, because induction, if you say this is a swan, this swan is white, this is also a swan, this swan is also white, now I conclude that all swans are white, then the premises also are true. Let's assume that for a moment that you see a swan and it is white, and you see another swan that is white, and then you conclude all swans are white, and then you say, well, even though that might be true, the truth of the conclusion is not entailed, does not follow necessarily from the two premises. Here, in deduction, it does. If it's true that all swans are white, and if it's true that this is a swan, then it also necessarily follows that this swan is white. So this is a logically valid way of reasoning. Just change the word white to green here to see that the conclusion still follows, even now it's clearly false. So you can say premise 1, all swans are green. If that's true, and if premise 2 is true, that this here is a swan, then the conclusion has to be that this swan is green. That has to be true. And here you see, okay, this is a logically valid reasoning. All A's are B, this is an A, well, then it logically follows that this is B. If the first premise is true, if the second premise is true, then the truth of the conclusion is entailed in the two premises. if you then have a conclusion that's clearly false, like all swans are green, then you say, okay, then either premise 1 or premise 2 or both are false. But the reasoning is logically valid. That means that if, so under the condition that the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true as well. The truth of the conclusion is logically entailed in the truth of the premises. That is, of course, a very nice way of reasoning, because if you reason in this way, it's logically valid. And if you reason in an inductive way, if you say this is a swan, it's white, this is a swan, it's white, all swans are white, then even if your premises are true, you're not certain that your conclusion is true. And here you can say, if I'm certain that my premises are true in deduction, if your premises are true, then you're also certain that your conclusion is true. And that is what's meant by a valid way of reasoning. The problem, of course, here is that there is an induction problem as well, because if you start with a law, then the question is, how did you discover that? That's the context of discovery. How did you discover that all swans were white? Well, you have seen 100 swans, they were all white, and now I conclude, I infer, using induction, that they were all white. Okay, that's the context of discovery. So I've discovered that. But then you have the induction problem. You haven't seen all swans, so you can't be sure. Then you can try to justify that. And then you say, well, how do I justify that? Well, there is this new swan I see here, and it's white as well. So it supports my general claim. But then, so that's the context of justification, but you're still using induction. Now you have 101 swans that were white. You still haven't seen all swans. You still haven't solved the induction problem. So even though deduction is a logical, valid way of reasoning, you start with a general claim, and it's doubtful whether you can ever be certain about it. But purely from a logical point of view, if you know that all A's are B, and if you also know that this is an A, then it logically follows that this A is B, and that's a logically valid way of reasoning. The fifth and maybe most important point of the logical positivist is that they said that we need to find a demarcation criterion to distinguish science from pseudoscience. So if we want to decide on the answer to the question what is science, the logical positivist gave us two answers. It said a statement or theory is scientific if it is verifiable. That was their initial answer, and later they changed this to a weaker answer, and that is a statement or theory is scientific if it is confirmable. So we'll explain in a moment what that means, but first let us look at a kind of common sense view of science and see why that is important. So what I want to show you is that you probably have a good idea of which disciplines are scientific, but it's more difficult to actually define science. So what is science? This also can be seen in two ways. You can say, okay, is physics science? What is science? Is physics science? Or what is the hallmark of science? And the first questions are easier than the second one. Because I pre-recorded this lecture, I did not do the survey with you, but usually I do a survey with my students, and I ask them whether the several disciplines mentioned here at the bottom are indeed scientific. So is physics science, is chemistry science, is psychology science, is philosophy science? And then you usually see that there is a kind of consensus about some of these disciplines. That is, physics, chemistry, astronomy usually score very well on being scientific. Psychologists also answer that psychology is a science, at least usually they do that. Philosophy, there is no consensus there. The same with law. I would indeed say that law is not scientific, and philosophy, at least large parts of philosophy, are definitely not scientific. And astrology clearly is the one that people usually say that is unscientific. So, and these results are basically the same all over every year. So this means that we have some common sense notion of what we use, what we mean by the word science. So physics is science, astrology isn't, law probably also isn't. Psychologists are usually adamant that psychology is, but the question, of course, is, aren't you biased? And well, at least we should, if we try to find a criterion that distinguishes science from pseudoscience, there should be at least two things in each category. In the category science, there should be something, and in the category pseudoscience, there should be something, or not science should be something. So physics probably needs to be in the category science, and astrology definitely not. And if everything ends up in the category not science, or if physics is not science, then you say, well, that's bad demarcation criterion. And on the other hand, if everything becomes science, then you also cannot make a distinction between science and non-science, and then your demarcation criterion also fails. So what we want is a clear boundary between, on the one hand, physics, chemistry, and medicine, and on the other hand, astrology. In all likelihood, most people will say that it is unscientific, or at least there is, I think, consensus about doing the dishes. Doing the dishes isn't science. And Heidegger's philosophy, we started this lecture with that, that clearly is not scientific. So, what is the demarcation criterion? What makes science science? Well, usually I also ask students that in a kind of language, in everyday language. So scientific statements, do they have to be true always? Do they have to be able to be checked in all cases? Forces in principle could be wrong. Do they have to be able to be checked by the senses, for instance, or objective? So you can come up with different ideas about what makes science science. And I also ask that in a survey. And then you see that there is usually some consensus that science does not always have to be true. If you ask psychologists, right? If you ask an academic, because I think truth is something that people that do not do a scientific study might think that that is what science is all about. Usually, psychologists in the third year say that falsifiability, so the possibility that it's wrong, that is a hallmark of science. Usually there is almost consensus about that. That's very good. I think that is the most important demarcation criterion. We'll talk about that in the next couple of lectures. I think you get this in your methodology or statistic course. But the consensus is not as clear as it is with physics or with astrology, say, or doing the dishes. So if you say that objectivity is a demarcation criterion, which many people say, and psychology is about subjective mental states, how can you reconcile that? Because then it seems that psychology is, by its own nature, subjective. So, how can you then, if we would agree that science has to be objective, how can psychology then be a science? So this is our question for at least for you. So we want to find a demarcation criterion that makes a distinction between science on the one hand and pseudoscience or non-science on the other hand. And then the question is, if we find one that does do that, if we find a demarcation criterion that says, yes, indeed, physics, chemistry, and medicine, they are all scientific, and astrology, doing the dishes, and Heidegger's philosophy, they're all non-science. What does such a demarcation criterion then do with the classification of psychology? Okay, so that's the important question here. So we will discuss many of these criteria, all 7, but then in the jargon, in the terminology of this course, we will look at that. We'll look at today's answers of the logical positivists. So they first said it's verifiability. We'll see that that's too strong and they had to weaken their demarcation criterion, and then they proposed confirmability. And what's at stake here, of course, is still this epistemological question. Where does knowledge come from? Because with knowledge you want to do something, right? You as a psychologist, or at least many of you, I assume, want to help people, and for that you need knowledge. And to have knowledge, to gain knowledge, to acquire knowledge, you need a method. And you want to use the best method in order to get real knowledge so you can really help people. You can understand society and mental problems in society to advance society, to make the world a little bit better. If you just help one person, you have gained a lot. So there really is something at stake here, because you say, where does knowledge come from? Well, we have to use our best method, and the logical positivists say it's science. And I think that still is the answer we give these days. Science is not a flawless method, but it is our best method to gain knowledge. That is why we look at scientists right now to find a solution to the corona crisis. There's a big problem. How do we get rid of corona? Well, you can try anything. You can try burning down 5G masts. That is not going to work, because it's based on nonsense, and it's based on conspiracy theories that they, whoever they are, want to, well, make us sick, and then we get a vaccine which has chips in it, so we are being tagged by Bill Gates. Whatever nonsense people believe. You want to have a proper method, scientific method, that has the best track record. So that's why we do that. That's why the logical positivists would say that. What's the best method to gain knowledge? Well, it's science. Why do we think that? Well, so far it worked better than all the other methods. So science provides us with knowledge, and now we need to know what science is to get rid of the pseudoscience, of all the bullshit, all the nonsense, all the metaphysical and theological debris of millennia, as the logical positivists have it, as we just saw. And as a psychologist, you want to help people. And if astrology is a really bad method of gaining knowledge about the world, about personalities and problems with that people can have, then don't use astrology. And that's of course the reason why you don't have astrology for psychologists, because it's a bullshit method. It doesn't work. But now we need to understand why. And that's why we have to find a demarcation criterion. So there is something at stake here. Basically, what's at stake is making the world a better place. So it's all very complicated what we're going to do. It's very theoretical, very abstract. I will try to give you as many examples as I can. And they usually are the examples these philosophers give themselves, so they're really boring, like all swans are white. I just use that example so you have an example on the exam, you can clearly understand it, and those examples usually work to convey the message. Okay, so what's the right demarcation criterion? What makes this distinction between science and non-science, and especially, of course, between science and pseudoscience? Because That's what is at stake. You want to say science is the method to gain knowledge. And then, of course, there are people that say astrology is a science as well, so it should be taught in universities. Okay, but the problem now is, or the idea now is, that you can classify astrology and doing the dishes and Heidegger's philosophy as not science. And if you then claim scientific status for that, then you're a pseudoscientist. And then you make astrology into pseudoscience. You could also say, well, I read my horoscope because I find it funny. I don't think that it really gains me any knowledge. It's just funny in a glossy magazine. Oh, there's a horoscope, let's have a laugh. Okay, nothing wrong with that. But as soon as you claim scientific status for it, then you say it's a science. It's really true what it says about the world. Well, and then it should be taught in universities, because then you miss something out. You miss out on facts if you don't do that. And we'll discuss this later when we talk about Kuhn and Feyerabend, who actually defend this. But just to show you what is at stake, there really is something at stake. Advancing society, helping other people, making the world a better place, that's at stake. Right. Let's look at the first answer the logical positivist gave to the question, what makes science science? What is the first demarcation criterion they proposed? That's verifiability. So again, a demarcation criterion is something that separates one thing from another. In this case, science from non-science, especially from pseudoscience. And for the logical positivist, that also is a distinction between meaningful sentences and theories and meaningless sentences and theories. So astrology is pseudoscientific and also meaningless. Heidegger's metaphysics is meaningless and unscientific. Newton's theory about natural laws is scientific and meaningful, right? So that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to make these distinctions. That's what they try to do. Now, what they are saying with verifiability is a sentence is scientific, is meaningful, if it can be empirically verified. And we're talking about a non-logical statement here, because you also have these logical statements. We've seen that briefly. We're not going to in detail, but that is why they say this. It's about empirical statements. It's not about logical statements, because logical statements, well, they belong to logic and they don't say anything about the world. We've seen that they don't believe that logic can provide us with knowledge. So logic is not synthetic and a priori. So we're talking about synthetic statements a posteriori, and the demarcation criterion then is empirical verifiability. You have to be able to say that a sentence or a theory is true by empirical verification. In principle, this has to be true, right? So it's verifiability. It's not about the actual verification. It has to be verifiable, just like a glass or a vase is breakable but not broken. So a theory has to be verifiable but not necessarily verified. So empirical verifiability means that you are able to check whether a sentence is true. So it's about the ability, verifiability. And you do that, well, the logical positivists are empiricists by using your senses. So let's take a look at the cup of coffee again. The sentence, there's a cup of coffee on the table. Can I verify that? Yes, I can verify that with my senses, because I can look at it and I can taste the coffee. Yes, it's coffee, it's back on the table, the cup of coffee is on the table. Now, according to the logical positivist, the experiences are neutral. So I actually see the cup and I actually taste the coffee the way the world is, the way the facts are. I perceive the facts, I observe the facts the way the facts are. These are raw data, these are sense data, and they are unproblematic according to our access to them is unproblematic according to the logical positivist. We'll get back to that in the end, at the end of this lecture, whether indeed our experiences are neutral, that is, that we experience the coffee the way the coffee is, or the cup the way the cup is, the way the world is, the way the facts are. So we'll get back to that at the end of this lecture. But let's take a look into empirical verifiability. Okay, so let's look at the consequence for philosophy. So if a sentence is meaningful, scientific, only if you can verify it with your senses, if you're able, in principle, to verify it with your senses, so a sentence like, there's a cup of coffee on the table, I can verify that with my senses, I can say, yes, that's true. How do I know that? Well, I observe the cup of coffee and therefore I know that it's true. Then the consequence for philosophy is that most things in philosophy become unscientific and meaningless. So logic is apart from that, so we're talking about empirical claims here, but of course you can still do logic because it's a tool for structuring your theories. But then epistemology, or maybe philosophy of science, that's the only thing you actually can still do, maybe, and the rest becomes meaningless. And of course that's basically what Wittgenstein 1, of course, said. He quit philosophy because he was interested in all those disciplines that basically do not make verifiable claims. Things about the good, the beautiful, the higher, the metaphysical. You can't say anything meaningful about that. You can't say anything scientific about that. And therefore Wittgenstein quit philosophy, and the logical positivist would say, well, therefore we should all quit that type of philosophy. We only should do logic and epistemology and philosophy of science. That's it. That's it. Okay, so that of course is a nice consequence for philosophy according to the logical positivist. Not too many other philosophers, of course. The consequence for social and behavioral sciences is, at first there is no problem, you could say, because we're talking about observable behavior, for instance. You have to become a behaviorist according to the logical positivist if you're a psychologist. As a sociologist, you also don't have problems with observing social behavior, behavior of people in groups. So you can do that. However, if you take a look at the general idea of sciences, what unifies sciences according to the logical positivist, then you'll see that there is a big problem. Because we have seen, okay, so if you're a sociologist, a psychologist, a physicist, a biologist, you all use the same scientific method. You all use the deductive nomological method. You start with a general claim, then something that falls under the general claim, and then you have a conclusion. You say all swans are white, this is a swan, therefore this swan is white. That's the structure of deduction, of deductive reasoning. That's a valid way of reasoning, that's why you should use it. But that means you all use general claims. Every scientific discipline uses general claims. Psychology about human beings, biology about, well, living beings, physics about non-living things, but they all use general claims. You all use laws. Now, can you verify a general law? That takes us back to the very first lecture where we had the example of Socrates claiming that he knew that all human beings are mortal. How can you know that? That's a general claim. You cannot know that. You cannot know that all human beings are mortal, because in order to know that 100% certain, with 100% certainty, right, you have a justification. You need to have checked all human beings and see whether they were mortal or not. And no, well, you cannot do that. that's practically impossible. You can't, and for the same reason, you can't establish that all swans are white. All swans are white. You have to check every swan in the entire universe, whether it's white or not. So you cannot verify it. It's practically impossible. In principle, you cannot do this. So any general claim is unverifiable. So there is no general claim that is scientific. And that means that sociology, biology, physics, psychology, all those disciplines are unscientific. You make claims. EMDR is an effective therapy for PTSD. Well, that's a general claim. You say it works for everyone. Loss feels stronger than gain, not just for you or just for me, but for everyone. An autism spectrum disorder is caused by a genetic deficiency. That goes for any. This is a general claim. If you say that is the case, then that is the case for everyone that has an autism spectrum disorder. So that means that psychology making general claims, but also physics making general claims, is unscientific according to this demarcation criterion of verifiability. So psychology is not a science because you cannot check all cases. But you could say, who cares that psychology is not a science in this, according to this demarcation criterion? Because physics isn't science either. So that means, basically, that it fails the common sense check. Nothing is science. The category of science, the set of scientific disciplines, is empty. So we say, what's the source of knowledge? It's science. What is science? Nothing. Okay, well, clearly your demarcation criterion doesn't work. You want to have two sets, science and non-science, and there have to be elements in both of them. And at least physics should be in the set of science, and hopefully astrology or something like that should be in the set of non-science. Heidegger's philosophy should be there, for instance. So clearly this is not a good demarcation criterion, and the logical positivist concluded, well, we thus need another demarcation criterion. So let's take a look at that. The second demarcation criterion the logical positivist suggests is confirmability. It's basically a weaker version of verifiability. So if you have a general claim like all iron expands when you heat it, or all swans are white, then verifiability means that you have to be able to show that the claim is actually true. So you can verify that it's true, so you have to be 100% certain. And we just saw that in general laws, we can't ever be certain. You cannot know that every piece of iron when you heat it, that it will expand, or you cannot know that all swans are white. So that means that demarcation criterion is too strong, but still you want to be able, as an empiricist, to say, well, I have this general law, and I think it's scientific when it can be confirmed via, of course, observation, doing experiments and observing the results of the experiments. And of course, now you say, well, it has to be confirmable. It has to be able to be confirmed. And of course, when you actually accept the claim, then of course you need to have some actual confirmation. But the problem, of course, now is that there are many sentences from, for instance, astrology that are confirmable, and actually you can say that will be confirmed maybe more sure a priori, that you're more sure a priori that they will be confirmed than all kinds of other claims. So sometimes nonsense is confirmed. In horoscope, so the prediction that X happens or not, you will find, so problems might arise at work Well, I said, if they arise and you say, see, I'm right, so you have confirmation, and if they don't, then you say, well, I said, they might arise. I didn't say they will arise. So many formulations of astrology are in that way. Or you can use Barnum sentences. Barnum was um, a circus director, I believe, who uh, was very good at manipulating people, apparently. And what he used was sentences to describe your personality, for instance. And then you can say, well, you are a person that's quite serious, but at a party you can be the life of the party, you can be the center of the party, and everybody, you make the party go. People like to hear stuff like that about themselves. So they see, oh yes, that's true, that applies to me. I'm a serious person, but well, at a party, I'm the man, right? So that is what people like to hear. So you know that if you ask people, is that a correct description? You already know that many people will say, yeah, that's a correct description of me, even though it might not be the case. But still you get confirmation of it when you ask people. So the problem with confirmability now is that if you have general claims, like EMDR is an effective therapy for PTSD, well, you can find, in principle, confirmation for that, and actually we have found confirmation for that. Loss feels stronger than gain. It goes for everyone. Well, you don't need to check everyone now to say, well, it is confirmable. You can find evidence, and we have found evidence. So we say, well, it is scientific, and we accept it. The same with the autism spectrum disorder is caused by a genetic deficiency claim. Again, a general claim, it is confirmable. In principle, you can find evidence for that. You know what you need to find when you do research. And when you actually find it, you say, well, yeah, I accept this claim. So is psychology a science according to the demarcation criterion? Yes, it is. One will be able to find some support for these claims. But the question, of course, is how much support is enough? One case? 100 cases? So now you see that psychology becomes a science, astronomy becomes a science, physics becomes a science. That's all very well. That's what we like. But now also, at least many claims of astrology also become science. So verifiability was too strong and it put everything in the category of not science, and confirmability seems to be too weak, so it puts everything, even as astrology, in the category of science. So again, the demarcation criterion doesn't make a strong separation between two categories in which and that in every category is something. It is making the claim now that basically everything is science. Well, great that psychology is science, but astrology is science as well. So it's basically, again, not a demarcation criterion. It doesn't make a demarcation, a distinction between the two categories.
Let's look at some problems with logical positivism.
Let's look at some of the problems. Basically, we have already seen one. The first problem, that there is no good demarcation criterion. We also briefly looked at the second problem, and the third one is new. We didn't touch upon that, so let's basically put them all together so you have a good. Just to repeat, verifiability as a demarcation criterion is too strong. You have a general claim. If you say, well, a general claim has to be verifiable before we can categorize it as scientific, then you say, well, no general claim is scientific because you can't verify a general claim because you have to check all the individuals the general claim applies to. And you can't do that. That's practically impossible. That means that the general claim is unverifiable and therefore unscientific. So you can weaken those this demarcation criterion. You say, well, no, it must not be verifiable, but it must be confirmable. And then it's too weak, because then you see that all kinds of claims from astrology, like you might get problems at work. Well, you know, you will only find confirmation for that, and it will never be refuted. So you will only get a confirming evidence for that, and therefore it should be part of science. And you want to get rid of those statements like, tomorrow you might have problems at work. Yeah, is that a scientific statement? No, it's something you already know, so you want to get rid of that. So that's, I think, the most problematic issue with logical positivism. They say science is the best method to gain knowledge, so it solves the problem of epistemology, but they can't find a proper definition, a proper norm a discipline has to adhere to if we want to classify it as science. So that's a big problem. The second problem is that they're faced with an induction problem. Basically, that's also the problem in verifiability, of course, because then you have a general claim, and how do you know that the general claim is true? The problem is you use induction, you generalize from an individual or some individuals to a general claim, and you say this swan is white, all swans are white, or these 100 swans are white, all swans are white. So the problem is you can't justify your general claim, you can't explain how you know that it's actually true. All sciences use deductive nomological model, so you need a nomological statement, your first premise, your general rule. How do you arrive at this general statement? Well, if you use induction, then it clearly is not a valid way of reasoning, so you can't justify your general claim. So the solution might be, well, let's do it another way, let's come up with another way with our general claim. So maybe you have all kinds of sociological or psychological preferences, and you come up with a general claim. That is what Neurath says, well, the seeker is allowed any method, so it doesn't need to be in the method of using induction. But what has been found must stand up to testing. Yeah, but what is testing in logical positivism? Well, confirming or verifying, and then you'll have the same problems again. Okay, so let's look at one really new problem. So the first two problems we touched upon in the explanation already, and so, well, given what you already knew, you probably immediately saw the problem there. So let's take a look at this picture. And it is about observation. So you look at the picture and the question is, what do you see? Now someone says, this is a picture of a vase. Now, the logical positivists were empiricists. So if you want to check whether that sentence is true, if you want to verify it or to confirm it, and in the case of a singular statement or a statement about a singular thing, you can do that. You can say, okay, this is a picture of a vase. Just like you can say, this is a swan. Maybe you have a problem with the general claim, all swans are white. Okay, so we have an induction problem there. Then the second premise is, this is a swan, or in this case, this is a vase. How do you establish that that's true? Well, you just see it. You look and you say, well, yeah, I see a vase as well, so that's true. It corresponds to the fact. And how do I check that? Well, I check it with my senses. The logical positivists were empiricists. So by looking in this case. Now, the problem is, according to opponents of logical positivism, that the theory, that the observation is not neutral. It's not objective in the sense that you can just look at the world and see a vase or see a cup of coffee or something like that. The opponents of the logical positivists say perception, observation, is theory-laden. Without a theory, one might not see the vase. If you look at this, you could also see this picture as two faces looking at each other. And if that's what you see, and you don't see the vase, and you keep seeing the two faces, then you're saying, well, I see something else. I see something different. The idea of theory relatedness of observation is that you don't have immediate access to the facts, you don't observe or perceive the facts the way they are. You need a theory to basically structure the input you get via your senses. So the visual experience is not only determined by the observed object. And I think that's in some sense pretty obvious. So you probably have seen brain scans in your books for brain and behavior or a course like that. And then you need to learn how to interpret that, because there is a picture, you might recognize it as a picture of a brain, but do you see the corpus callosum, for instance? You need to have a theory how to interpret the data. The same with a microscope. I don't know whether you ever took biology class and had to look into a microscope, and then, well, you had to see some cells or something like that, and then the book you have that depicts what you should see is totally different from what you see in the microscope, but taking a long time to practice, you'll in the end learn the theory of how to interpret what you get from input from the microscope, and you'll actually see what's in the book. So clearly that you can give examples where perception is not raw, where perception is not clearly objective in the sense that you actually have direct, immediately access to the objective facts, to the world the way the world is. Now, the opponents of logical positivism, the opponents of the empiricists that say, well, you just have to look at what's in the world, and if someone makes a claim, this is a vase, or these are two faces, or this is a cup of coffee, you just have to look at it and you'll see the cup of coffee, and then you say, yes, this sentence is true. But if you need a theory to interpret what you see, what the input is you get in via your senses, in this case your eyes, then you don't just see the cup of coffee, you need a theory to enable you to see that. If you don't have the theory, it's basically just chaos. It looks pretty much like we discussed in the lecture on Kant. You have input, but you also need something, some categories, Kant would say. In this case, it's a theory. You need a theory to interpret these data. And in Kant, you have all these categories that are the same, but in this argument, the idea is, well, you can have a different theory, and then you see, then you observe, and you perceive something else. So take a look at this picture. I really can't draw, but I did my best to make a picture that is a bit ambiguous. It could be a duck, it could be a rabbit. There is this classic example, of course, this classic drawing, but well, then we have all kinds of problems with copyright. So theory one here is this is a picture, this is a drawing of a duck, and theory two is this is a picture of a drawing of a rabbit. Now, how do you establish which one is correct? Well, an empiricist would say, look at it. Look at it and you'll see that it's, so if you're an empiricist and defend theory one, they say, look at it and you'll see the duck. It's a duck. Just look at it. But you could also have a different theory that you use, and you might use this, you probably use that even unconsciously. You have these data coming in and you interpret this as a rabbit. The left part are the ears, and according to theory one, the left of the drawing is the beak of the duck. So how do you establish which one is correct? By looking. But now you see that the data, the input you get via your eyes, both fit the theory that it's a duck, and it fits the theory that it's a rabbit. So you can't determine by using the empirical data which theory is correct. So this is called the underdetermination. You can't determine it of the theories, which of the two theories is correct, which is true, by the empirical data, because the empirical data support both theories, so you can't determine it. So that is a problem. That's a problem for an empiricist. If you're an empiricist, you only have this data, and you say, well, I need to check whether a sentence, a sentence from biology, like all swans are white, whether that's true or not, and I have to check it using my senses. But given a different theory, I might see something else. And the idea of the opponents of logical positivists is that this goes for all observation. All observation is theory laden, and then the problem arises that you can always have a different theory to interpret the data entering your sensory system. And that means you can't just use your observation to check whether a theory is true or not, even if it is just a statement about this animal here. I say that this is a swan. Well, you might be wrong. It might be a duck, according to the opponents of the theory. So this would always be the case. Observation, perception would always be theory laden. You would always need a theory to interpret the chaos of input. And these chaos of input always allow for more than one theory. They always fit more than one theory. And therefore, basically that is a big problem for the empiricism of logical positivism. The conclusion for this last problem we discuss with respect to logical positivism is that, well, everything depends on interpretation, everything you observe. There are no raw sense data. You can't just say, I see the cup of coffee, I see a duck, I see a swan. What you need to say is, well, given my background theory, my observation theory, the theory that I have learned, I see a duck. And someone else who has learned a different theory might see a rabbit. So there are also always multiple interpretations of the data possible. So logical positivism truly has some problems. We could argue that the project of the logical positivism has failed. The project has failed because the most important thing, I think, was the attempt to find demarcation criterion, and both suggestions they did, verifiability and confirmability, were not suitable as a demarcation criterion, as we have seen. And there are some further problems with their deductive nomological model and the interpretation of the empirical basis. Is this really immediately clear what you see, or are there raw data? No, there seems to be an interpretation necessary. So the project has failed. And what is important is they knew that. The question, of course, is logical positivist being empiricist, whether the rationalist did do any better. And we'll take a look at that next time. This rationalist we'll take a look at is just one philosopher, that is Karl Popper. So he defends rationalism, and he comes up with another demarcation criterion, and that is falsifiability. We look into that in detail in next lecture. Finally, let's look at an example question. The question is about confirmability, one of the two demarcation criteria of the logical positivist. So if confirmability is the demarcation criterion between science and non-science, how would physics be classified and how would astrology be classified? Well, on a new exam, you could, of course, see variations of this question. I could use verifiability, for instance, and I could use psychology, obviously, as one of the two sciences you should apply the demarcation criterion to. So let's take a look. Both as science, well, basically, confirmability is a very weak demarcation criterion. All disciplines we have discussed make confirmable claims, and claims that also are, to some extent, are being confirmed. So basically physics would be science, and astrology would be science, and psychology would be science. So in this case, answer A is correct. Both as science, so look at B, C, and D. Only physics would be classified as a science. Well, maybe that's our intuition, but that's not what the demarcation criterion says. Only astrology would be classified as a science. Now, it would also classify physics as a science because physics also does confirmable claims, makes confirmable statements. Both as non-science, well, that's clearly incorrect because both make confirmable claims. So answer A is the only correct answer.
That's it for lecture 4. Stay safe.